I like to start off each stitch along with some basic embroidery tips. Each strand of embroidery floss is made up of 6 smaller strands. So when you see on a pattern, if it says to use 6 strands, then you're going to be using the full strand of embroidery floss. But if there's a smaller number, so say it said to use 3 strands, then I would split the embroidery floss in half by use only 3 at a time. So then you would just take your 3 strands here, the 3 small strands, and thread that onto a needle. I like to use a bigger needle when I'm using a larger amount of thread. So usually when I'm using 6 strands of thread, I use my biggest needle. And then I'll use a smaller strand when I am working with smaller amounts of thread. There are different ways to secure your embroidery in the back. So when you bring your needle up from the back of the fabric to the front, you want the thread to stay in the back. I like to start, if you're a beginner, just by tying a basic knot in the end. And sometimes I'll even tie 2 to make it secure. As you get more advanced, there are different ways that you can secure the thread in the back without having to tie a knot, and that will keep your work neater. But for now, as a beginner, I suggest just tying a knot in the end of your thread. It's also nice, but not required, to have a pair of small embroidery scissors, and these just help you get into the small spaces to clip off the ends of the thread. As you're stitching, you might find that the thread gets kind of twisted, and every once in a while I like to take my work and just dangle my thread and see how it kind of spins around. That will make it so that you don't get knots in the thread, which can be very frustrating. So make sure you do that every once in a while, especially if you find that your thread is starting to curl up. When you're stitching, you want to keep the back of your work as neat as possible. So if you're stitching something over here, you don't want to skip over and start stitching something way over here, because then you're going to have this line from here to here, and then you're going to turn your work over and you'll be able to see through the fabric and see that line going across the back. So the better way to do that would be just to secure this thread here and then start a new thread in the different location that you need to start stitching. To secure your thread in the back when you're done stitching something, there's a couple things you can do. You can just take your needle and run it under a couple of times, and then snip off the end of that thread. Or sometimes if there's not a lot of thread to run my needle under, I like to run my needle under what is there just once, leave a loop, stick my needle back through the loop, and then pull that through to make a knot. And sometimes I'll do that twice to make a double knot, and then you would just trim off your end there. There are several different methods that you can use to trace your patterns. The easiest one that I like to do is just take a light table, and I got this on Amazon. I'll link to it below. And if I'm using, this only works if I'm using a light piece of fabric, so mostly just my white. And then you take your pattern, place it underneath the fabric, turn the light on, and then I like to use these friction pens, and only use these if you are 100% sure that whatever you're marking up is going to be covered, because these don't always disappear as they're supposed to. So you trace your design, whatever it is, and the light table will help you see it. And then when you're done stitching, if there's just a tiny bit showing on the edge, that's okay, and then you can iron it, and then it will, for the most part, it will disappear. I only like to use this lightest color gray. The other ones I found don't really disappear as well at all. As an alternative, you can also use these water-soluble pencils. They also have disappearing ink pens, and same kind of thing. Don't use these unless you are for sure know that they're going to be covered up, because these don't always fade. And make sure, so with the pen, you wanted to iron over that when you're done. Make sure you don't iron over this until you have washed it with some water first, because otherwise it will be set in forever and it won't come out. Another method that I like to use is using this dressmaker's carbon paper. So if I have, for example, this natural colored linen, this blue is going to be my best bet of a color. to trace over. So what you want to do is you have the fabric on the bottom, then the blue carbon paper, and then you put your pattern on top, and make sure that everywhere that your pattern is, that the blue paper is underneath. And you've got to make sure also that your fabric and stuff isn't moving around, so sometimes I like to tape it down. But for this, you have to trace very, very hard to get it to make an impression. So sometimes that hurts my hand, and sometimes the impression isn't dark enough, so this isn't my favorite. But sometimes that's what you got to do. So there'll be a very faint impression of the blue line there. And then if you're using a dark fabric, you would want to use a white carbon paper. So again, same thing, carbon paper on top of fabric, pattern on top of carbon paper, and then trace it very firmly with a pencil. And that will give you a nice white impression on your dark fabric. Another thing that I have to be honest, I haven't tried yet, but I bought this so that I could try it. I know a lot of embroidery artists like to use this, so I'm excited to try it out. It's a sticky Fabrice, and it's a self-adhesive fabric-like water-soluble stabilizer. So I believe what you do is you just cut out a piece of it, and you can trace whatever you want on it, and then slap it on your design, and then you embroider actually through this. And then once you're done with your project, you soak it in some water, and then this paper just disappears. So that's kind of neat, and I'm really excited to try this out, and I'll let you know if I do and if I'm successful with it. So those are all my tips as far as supplies go. My biggest tip for you, especially as a beginner, is to realize that it doesn't have to be perfect. It's the small inconsistencies that make it look like it's something that's handmade and not machine made. And remember that you can always take out your stitches if you make a mistake.